9th is here. Wearing state gear or regular stuff?
Yes.
Curry is online. Darby's here in state gear, I think. Yeah. Fisher is online. Hamilton is online. Hellman. Ashley's here in state gear. So is Crystal, also in state gear. Taylor is here. Norris is here in state gear. Rollins. Saunders is online. Shamblin is in state gear. Vargas is here. Hey, did I miss anybody? All right, so really quickly for announcements, again, I'll remind you, this is your last week to do a true retake of exam 3. I think I've only got like 3 of you scheduled. Some of you don't need to because you did great. If you did very poorly on the exam, you might want to contact me and find a time to retake it. Even if for some, like I said before, if you somehow get a lower score, then we'll just keep your higher score. So that's the only way that this retake is like the other one we've done. So you have nothing to lose other than the time it takes to study and retake it. So any questions about the retake? All right. Again, I'll remind you, independent work is technically done, but I will definitely take non-written work, like doing the videos and the other stuff. If you have questions about what the other stuff is, read my announcements or talk to me during office hours. And then unofficially, you can still turn in papers, but it'll be at the bottom of my priority list. So if you still plan to do that, then the sooner you get them turned in, the more likely it will be that I grade it. But if you turn in a bunch of papers on the last week in class, I can almost guarantee you I will not have time to grade your extremely late work. What else? Lab. This week, you're supposed to come into lab, so make sure you bring your computer. If you've already have it done before it's time to do it, and I see it, keep an eye on your emails, because I'll leave you a message and say you don't need to come in. What else? I guess that's it. Any questions about anything? Lab, independent work, exams. No, that's it. All right. So let's get started. I will remind everybody who's online right now, please send in your keywords. We have some people who are consistently not sending in the words. It doesn't make sense, because if you're here paying attention, you woke up this morning, might as well get it done. Speaking of the words, so the first word, in honor of the upcoming Lincoln birthday, will be USMC. So for those of you who are here in person, you can send those in for extra credit. For those of you who are live right now, send that in for attendance words. For those of you who are watching the video later, don't send in the word USMC. Look up some fact and send me that fact. So send me a sentence that has some fact about the USMC. Changing it up a little bit. All right, so let's get back to this discussion. We were talking about Charles Darwin's journey, right? So we're kind of talking about how he came to know, or how we came to know what we know about evolution. And your old textbook kind of tells it like a story. Your new textbook tells it like a story a little bit, so that's where I'm sticking with. And we talked about his observations, right? The last thing we talked about when we talked about his observations was that he noticed that organisms, they seem more closely related if they were geographically close together, as opposed to having the same environment. So for example, the animals on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America looked a lot more like the animals on South America than they did maybe in the similar environment, but off the coast of Australia, right? So it was more, what he was saying is geographic proximity was more important. On that note, some of his new insights, and I didn't talk about Charles Lyell yet, right? I think pretty sure this is where we left off. Anyway, while he was on his voyage, he didn't have much else to do. The DVD player wasn't working, the internet was down, so he had to read books. One of the books he read was this book called The Principles of Geology by this guy, Charles Lyell. You can look him up for independent work if you want. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click on his name. That's actually a link. It will just take you to a little short video that talks about him and his book. But in this book, this guy basically said that Earth was ancient. So remember what we talked about previously. Back in the day, and then for some people today, they thought the world was like 6,000 years old, right? That was the idea. And again, in this time period, this is where people start to understand, well, maybe it's not like that. Maybe the world's actually been around a lot longer. So again, these are new ideas. So this guy was saying, again, the Earth is ancient. that has been sculpted over millions of years by gradual geological processes that continue today, right? So think about like the Grand Canyon or, the Himalayas, right? Those are the tallest mountain ranges of the world. The reason the tallest mountain ranges in the world is because those continents are colliding, right? So they're getting bigger. Mount Everest is getting bigger, for example. Another example, not that you need to know any of this, the Appalachian Mountains used to be the tallest mountain ranges of the world. These mountains used to be the tallest, right? Because North America hit Asia and Africa, and that created those mountains. But then now they're separating, and then weathering has just basically brought them down. Anyway, so he's reading this book. He's on this voyage. He actually did witness the power of natural forces to change Earth's surface because he was in an earthquake. And while he was in the earthquake, he saw a rock, basically, or a big chunk of land, rise by 1 meter. That doesn't seem like a lot, right? 1 meter is about 3 feet. But whatever, that's a good bit, considering he saw that happen right in front of his eyes. Then he had to think, all right, well, over millions of years, that could be a lot of change. So because of all this, and because of all the things he'd seen and all the things he'd read, Charles began to doubt that Earth and its organisms had been created just a few thousand years earlier, right? So again, we know this now, but at the time, this was new. These were new thoughts. Then he got back to England. He was reflecting on his observations, right? So again, he had a lot of observations. He was writing them down. He was very scientific about it. He was analyzing his specimen collection because, like I said in the previous discussion, he was collecting a lot of specimens, animals, plants, things like that. And of course, he was working with his colleagues. What didn't happen, not that this is important, but just so you know, it's not like he was on this trip and then he landed back on England and, maybe took a day off and then sat down and wrote this book. Like, oh, no. This, he stewed on it for years and years, and it took him a long time to write it. But eventually he concluded that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways. And this is the big part that we talk about, right? This is where we're getting at about speciation, or like you learned from the last lab, Charles Darwin said, natural selection is how new species arise, and that's what this is, right? He said that over time, differences gradually accumulated by a process he called descent with modification. Then that's when he finally proposed natural selection. I put a big old X through this. This is a reminder. This is all kind of like a little background of how we came to know what we know. Except, oops, maybe I should have made the X so big. Do we need to know what natural selection is? And obviously, depending on where you look, you're going to get a slightly different explanation or definition. But from your old textbook, the definition was individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals with other traits, right? That's from your old textbook. And that's a lot of what you need to know. But what else is missing? Can anybody tell me what else is missing about this? Because that's a true statement. And that was the beginning of what you needed to write in that last lab, right? There has to be some variation within individuals. Those variations have to be inherited, right? So like tattoos versus no tattoos won't matter for humans because you can't inherit that. It has to be heritable traits. And even though it doesn't say it necessarily, it kind of alludes to it, those differences need to either give you an advantage or a disadvantage for it to affect natural selection. So what else is this missing? Yes, individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. So then what? What is the result of that? And I should have put it down there because this is the important part. The population changes over time, right? That's the important part. So yes, it doesn't matter if individuals have these certain characteristics. It has to be where they survive because of it. And then they reproduce because of it. And then because of that, the population changes to look like whatever advantage it was that those individuals had, the population will eventually have that advantage. That's another thing I was going to focus on based on the lab. Okay, based on the lab, what a lot of people wrote, they left this part off. Right, so you guys were right. Like if I wrote on yours incomplete, keep going, this is what I mean. You probably wrote something along the lines of this. Individuals have certain inherited traits and make them more likely to survive. But that doesn't help. That's only part of the story. Just surviving is only part of the story. So say, for example, there was some mutation in, I don't know, whales, let's say killer whales, right? Let's say there was some sort of mutation in the killer whales in the males of the species, and it allows them to live longer, but it also makes them sterile, right? That's not going to affect natural selection because, yes, it will help them survive, whatever this mutation is that I'm thinking of. this hypothetical mutation. But if they can't pass it along, then that's not going to affect natural selection. So again, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is a very important bullet point. Natural selection is where there's an advantage that helps something survive, and because they survive, they reproduce. And because they reproduce, they're passing down those genes that gave them that advantage. And then eventually, over time, the population is going to change to look more like them. One last, more important thing, or one important thing that I'm going to say again later. Individuals do not evolve, right? So the individual either has the advantage or they don't, but the individual itself didn't change. Like, so going back to your moth lab, there was never like a light colored moth, and then it started getting dark, and it was like, oh, I better become dark, right? No individual moth changed colors. There was some light ones, there were some dark ones. The light ones started getting eaten. The dark ones started reproducing more, therefore the population changed over time. Any questions about that? All right, we're gonna come back to that a lot. Again, upon his return to England, he hypothesized that as descendants of remote ancestors spread into various habitats over millions and millions of years, that natural selection resulted in the diverse modifications or evolutionary adaptations that fit into the specific ways of life in their environment. We're going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to just go ahead and roll right through it. I'm not going to ask any questions about this. So let's jump into his theory. Actually, the next word for attendance will be theory. So for those of you who are in person, you can send that word in for extra credit. For those of you watching live, send me that word for full, attendance. For those of you watching the video, take a picture of me pointing at the word theory. Send the picture and the word. All right, here we go. Like I said, he didn't do this right away. It's not like he got back to England and just said, oh, I know natural selection now, right? No, he stewed on it. He worked on it. For about 2 decades, he worked on it. And then finally, he wrote his book. Meanwhile, there was this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. I'll put it next to this only because I'm not going to ask you about him. But he was kind of basically doing the same stuff. He was also a British naturalist. He was also making trips. He also was in some islands. And remember when I was talking about islands, how that's relevant to this discussion, because, if the island is far enough away from the mainland, then it's going to be hard for new life to get to these islands. But it's close enough to where occasionally it does happen, which sets the stage for all these discussions. But anyway, long story short, Alfred Russel Wallace is a similar guy doing similar things that came up with similar conclusions. If you download the PowerPoint and click that little link, you can watch a little something about it. Here we go. So he finally published his book. I can ask you the name of it, but the book is called On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in this book, he made 2 big proposals. Not that I'm going to ask you what his proposals are, but you do need to know these because it's like the big theme of what we're talking about. Existing species descended from ancestral species, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. Those were his 2 proposals. Again, I'm going to put it next to this just to say I'm not going to ask you about that. For 2 reasons. First of all, this is usually the point of contention. This first bullet point, when people say they don't believe in evolution, that's usually what they mean. Usually when they say, I don't believe in evolution, they don't actually know what evolution means, but they know they don't believe in that part. And if you don't believe in that part, that's fine too. That's up to you. Sorry, I was just listening to the music. And the second bullet point, as I already said before we even got started, natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. As I told you earlier, and as we're going to talk about later, that's just one of the mechanisms, right? So there's other ways that things evolve. So, again, this is a bunch of build-up, a bunch of introduction to what you're going to learn later. So I'm not going to ask you anything about this necessarily, but the idea of evolution has generated predictions that have been tested and verified by over 150 years of research. So basically, what your old textbook and what your new textbook is saying is, this isn't just some hypothesis. This is a theory. This is a good time to remind you of what a theory is, even though we talked about it way back in chapter 1. Remember, a theory is not the same as a hypothesis, right? Theory has widely accepted, or is a widely accepted explanatory idea, right? It's widely accepted. A hypothesis isn't. It's broader in scope than a hypothesis, like you learned in chapter 1. It's so big and broad that it generates new hypotheses. And again, the more important part, it's supported by a large body of evidence. So the colloquial way that people use the term theory is not what a theory is, right? Usually when people say, oh, it's just a theory, what they mean is it's a hypothesis. So yes, evolution is just a theory, but a theory is a big thing in science. Just like there's the theory of gravity and the theory of relativity, right? So these are big, right? Theories don't mean what most people think they mean. Anyway, that being said, the theory of evolution states that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present day. So then I'm not going to ask you the definition of the theory of evolution. So let's jump into the evolution evidence. Here we go. Instead of just saying, all right, evolution's a thing, trust me, we're going to dive into this a little bit, talk about the evidence. And by the way, this is a whole course for some people in undergrad, right? What you're learning, this one chapter is a whole course. Actually, this one portion of the chapter is a whole course. So, evolution leaves observable signs. Biological evidence, or evolution has left a lot of evidence. You don't need to write this down because we're talking about them individually. But it's left evidence in fossils and in today's organisms. And if you click this, you can watch a little video about some of the evidence. And even if you click that sign, there's a little video you can watch about the evolution, or evidence of evolution. So let's talk about fossils first. I might ask you what a fossil is, though you probably already know. A fossil is, whoops, it's not there. Well, in this context, a fossil documents the differences between past and present organisms, right? So we can look at the dinosaurs, for example. Those are like usually the more famous fossils, and see how this species looks a lot like this species that's alive now, but it's different than this species that's alive now in these different ways. And it does show, and again, we all know this now, but back in the day, this was new. It shows that many species have become extinct, right? We've seen T-Rex fossils, but we've never seen a T-Rex walking down the street, right? We know that these animals don't exist anymore. Your book and your old textbook as well also point out that soft parts of organisms decay rapidly, but the hard parts that are rich in minerals may remain as fossils. So that's why there's a lot of missing fossils, right? Because some animals, some parts, they just don't fossilize well. Also, you might not know this. Not all fossils are actual remnants, right? So usually, again, when people think of fossils, they're probably thinking dinosaur bones. But it's not always that. Your book talks about this. There's casts, which are buried organisms that decompose and leave an empty mold. So imagine, I know this sounds weird because we don't have any fossils of humans, but if a human were to die and get covered in mud, but then that mud got really hard and solidified, but then the human decayed inside of it, there would be like a little mold, right, where you could see what the human looked like. There'd be nothing in there, except a bunch of whatever's left from the decomposed person. But you can look at the mold and see like the outside of what that human looked like. Then there's imprints, right? So there's a lot of footprints, burrows, things like that. The fun one, coprolites, that's fossilized poop, basically. Actually, that's what this is a picture of. If you click that picture, it's a little short video. It's kind of funny. So there's a picture or a little video where they have fossilized poop in a natural history museum, and this employee's taking it out and letting everybody touch it. Like, here's a fossil, and everybody's like, "Oh, cool, fossils." And the kids too, especially the kids, like, "Oh, a fossil." And then he tells them what coprolite means, and it's like, "That's fossilized poop." And some of them are like, "Ew," and they freak out. But anyway, yeah. So those are just some other examples of fossils. I'm probably not going to ask you about the different fossils, but the point is, fossils are not just what you think of them. They're not just always animals or animal bones. Sometimes there's other stuff. Another term I might ask you about, but probably not, but you probably already know it. Paleontologists. Those are scientists who study fossils. Anyway, any questions so far? All right. So it is very rare that an entire organism, including the soft parts, get encased in a medium that prevents decomposition. But it does happen. So your book gives a couple examples. Actually, I need to reread your textbook. I don't remember if this example is in your new textbook. It's definitely in your old one. So, and I'll just show you pictures of it. These pictures are definitely from your old textbook, right? So here we have an insect. I'm sure you guys have seen Jurassic Park. This portion of that movie was very accurate. There's an insect. It landed on a tree. It got covered in sap. Eventually, that sap turned into amber, basically a mineral, and the insect was perfectly preserved. Sometimes we've also found frozen animals, and you can look that up for independent work. There's a lot of frozen animals that we found. Obviously not from the dinosaurs age, but somewhere between here and there. Again, footprints are good examples. Petrified wood, that's an example. And then, of course, the thing most people think about are bones. But then any questions on what fossils are? All right, pretty simple stuff, right? So let's talk about the fossil record. It's kind of hard to see. I don't know if you can tell, but this picture was from I-64. I don't remember where. But you can kind of see, can you guys see the lines on the rocks? I know it's kind of hard to see with the lighting, but can you guys see the lines in the rocks? All right. And also notice, of course, you have to ignore these lines. That's just from where the humans have cut it away to make the road. But looking at these lines, right, you can imagine that it used to be like this, right? But some kind of change in the geography has shifted it, right? So this is like the top, and this is like really old stuff. So because of that, we can tell, for example, if someone found a fossil right here, let's call that spot A, and someone found a fossil right here in spot B, someone found a fossil here, spot C, even without doing any kind of really radiometric dating or anything like that, we can tell that whatever creature was found right here, whatever fossil this is a lot newer than this one, which is a lot newer than that one. Does that make sense? Because it's just like layers. In a sense, that's just like digging down deep. So that's what the fossil record is. The sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers, marking the passage of geological time. So that's how we can tell, you know, when someone says, when they're talking about species that aren't even around anymore, and we say, you know, these were around before these went extinct before those, that's how we know. One of the ways, that's the simplified version of the answer, right? We can tell just by where we found them in the fossils, in the rocks. Anyway, any questions about the fossil record? All right, here's something else you should know. As Darwin acknowledged, the fossil record is in fact incomplete. So a lot of people say that, a lot of people who oppose evolution, or at least evolution explaining where we came from. Because they say, all right, well, how is it we have this species and we have this species? Well, where's all the fossils of the in-between? Well, many organisms didn't live in areas that favor fossilization. So it's not as if every species has been fossilized, right? There are some species that came before us that we'll just never know about because they just didn't get fossilized. A lot of it also, in addition to that, many fossils were in rock layers that were later distorted or destroyed by geological processes. So again, as a reminder, you know, the Himalayan mountains are getting bigger right now they're getting bigger because those are two continents that are crushing into each other. So think about that. There's any fossils that were there, they're getting destroyed right now, right? They're in between two continents getting crushed. Or going back to the example I gave on Monday when I was talking about Seattle and how those mountain ranges came. There you have the Pacific plate going under the North American plate, right? So again, you've got continents colliding and just destroying fossils. So again, that's another reason why we don't have a complete fossil record. And then finally, not all fossils are accessible to paleontology, right? So we're still finding new fossils. That's another reason we have an incomplete fossil record, because we haven't found them all yet. And there's some, like this bullet point says, that we're just never going to get to. We just can't get to it. So any questions about that? All right, I'll go through this part pretty quickly too. There won't be any questions on it. But Darwin did predict the existence of fossils that showed transitional forms, like I was saying earlier, like, well, if we see this species and this species, where's the middle species? And we have found some of those. And Darwin predicted that we would. So we have transitional fossils that show a combination of traits. This is a textbook example from your old textbook. Again, I need to reread your new one. I don't remember if this is in there, but it's just an example. So I'm not going to test you on it. I never would. Archaeopteryx. So you can see, I know that's what the artist thinks it looks like, but it's kind of like a mix. It's a good transition between the dinosaurs, right, the reptilian dinosaurs versus the birds we know today. So we know that birds were descendant from dinosaurs. And we have some transitional fossils that show that. So any questions? Again, I'll put it next to that as a reminder. I'm not going to ask you about that example. So like I said, this comes from your old textbook. I'm going to skip this part. Every chapter of your old textbook had something called the process of science. I highly recommend reading it, even though I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But I like this one because they were talking about the science project that they were talking about, the research was talking about whale evolution. And what I loved about it is your book, the old textbook, explains what we thought we knew about whale evolution. And then later in the chapter, they come back and it's like, well, that's before we knew anything about DNA and other things. And I love that they show that, things change, hypotheses change with technology, and science is not set in stone. Anyway, here we go. We're done. We're still talking about evidence from evolution, or evidence of evolution. We're done talking about fossils. Now we're going to talk about homologies. Does anybody know what homologies are? Or let me ask you another question, because I've told you this before, so you can remember. What does the prefix homo mean in science?
Okay.
Perfect. Yes. So obviously, whatever I'm about to teach you has something to do with things being the same, right? So here we go. Similarities resulting from common ancestry are known as homologies. But what are homologies? That's this right here. I should point an arrow. Homologies are characteristics and ancestral organisms that are altered over time as descendants face different environmental conditions. Basically, what we're saying is homologies are things that are still the same, but varied and a little bit different. Related species can have different characteristics with underlying similarities, yet different functions. And it's hard to see maybe what this is, but I think that's a human hand, maybe a chimpanzee hand. That might be a horse hoof, maybe a camel hoof. And we're not going to get into too much details there, but those are homologies, right? We all have all vertebrates other than snakes. We've got 4 limbs, right? And those are homologies. We'll talk about it. Darwin cited similarities among vertebrate forelimbs. Again, these are our forelimbs as evidence of common ancestry. So again, other than snakes, all vertebrates have some version of this, right? Arms, forelegs, flippers, wings, right? These are all the same, or come from the same thing because we have a common ancestor. And over time, all those things changed, right? So bats turned their forearms or their forelimbs into wings so they could fly, right? Dolphins turned them into flippers so they could swim. A lot of animals still use them to help run. Humans have turned them into ways of manipulating things, right? So that's just one example. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about forelimbs. But yeah, this picture's not from your textbook. But if you look, we can see that generally speaking, we all have 5 phalanges, right? It's all variations on the same thing. And this is different. This isn't even all mammals. Here we have a human, a reptile, another mammal, right? A cat, a whale, a bat, a frog, which is an amphibian, a bird. Yet we all have these similarities. This is a picture from your old textbook. It's a lot more easy to look at than the other one's. Very simple. This one's just pointing out the fact that we have carpals in this forearm, right? This forearm bone. So you can see there's similarities. Again, because the idea is we have a common ancestor. Now, let's get a little bit more specific. Under homologies, like under that subcategory, we have something called homologous structures. And basically, that's everything I've been describing. So technically, all those things, I'm talking about the similarities of forearms, those are called homologous structures. Anatomical similarities in different organisms. You need to know that. Homologous structures. They have different functions, but are structurally similar because we have a common ancestor. And just so you know, as you might have guessed, like I said, homologous structures, it's like a subcategory of homologies. So as you might guess, there is going to be yet another subcategory of homologies. So homologies, right, we're just saying there's things that are similar due to common ancestry. Now I'm getting really specific and saying when we're talking about structures, those are called homologous structures. Your new textbook does a great job of talking about this. It goes into a lot of detail, actually. Speaking of which, when you're reading your textbook, if it's giving you more detail than I've given you in the lecture, you just go ahead and make a note of that and say, I don't need to know that for the exam. If I don't tell it to you in this class, then I'm doing that on purpose. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Okay, next word for attendance will be bat. already said what to do. So again, if you're watching the video, later in the day, later in the week, take a picture of a screenshot, be pointing to where you're at. All right. So those are homologous structures. Like I said, that's just one subcategory of homologies. Let's talk about the other one. Advances in molecular biology have provided much deeper understanding of homologies. So the evolutionary history of each species is actually documented in our DNA that is inherited from our ancestral species. I'm not going to read all this. Long story short is, the last stuff we were talking about, we were saying there's similarities in our structures, right? Those are homologous structures. But there's also similarities in our DNA, right? So I've got a whole book on it. I wish I had time and said you guys should read this. It's a great book about how the broken genes in the human body, for example. Like I know I mentioned this earlier in the semester, but all mammals, other than humans and some primates, can make their own vitamin C. Right? We're one of the few mammals that can't do it. And we still have the gene to do it. It's just that our gene is broken. And that's a great example of this, even though your book doesn't talk about it, right? So we have this common ancestor with primates, right? So somewhere, that common ancestor, that gene, there was a mutation and it broke, right? And then everything that descended from that one common ancestor also had that broken vitamin C gene, right? Which is interesting because it's not like it was on purpose. If it was on purpose, why would we even have the broken gene? Why have the gene at all, right? Anyway, there's so many good examples. You can look it up if you want for independent work. And again, your book dives really deep into this and gives a lot of information. Basically, this is the same stuff I'm saying here, right? Molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are regulated, right? Because first of all, like we've said all semester, well, almost all semester, all organisms use the same genetic language, right? DNA and RNA. We all go through very similar processes, right? Photosynthesis, if you're photosynthetic, respiration, right? All eukaryotic organisms go through the same process of respiration, the same way, basically speaking. Like we said earlier in the last chapter, the genetic code is basically universal. So again, you can take the glowing gene from a jellyfish and insert it into a pig, and the pig will glow. And that has been done. That was the picture I showed you in the previous chapter. Or, more importantly for us, bacteria engineered with human genes can produce human proteins, right? That's where we get insulin. Back in the day, diabetics had to get it from basically pigs, right? They used pigs. Pigs would produce insulin, and we harvested it from them. It wasn't nearly as efficient. Now, we have bacteria that do it. So some scientists literally took the gene out of a human genome that says this is how you make insulin. They put it into the bacteria, and because the code is universal, the bacteria doesn't know any better. It follows the instructions, it makes the protein, and then we harvest the protein. Of course, these are all just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about examples. So yes, again, big picture here. We're talking about, well, big picture. We're talking about evidence of evolution, right? And then under that, we've been talking about homologies, which are similarities. And then now, under that category, we're being very specific and talking about the homologies of our genes, right? Our DNA, our RNA. Geneticists have uncovered hidden molecular homologies. So organisms may retain genes that have lost their function. I've already talked about this. I was jumping the gun a little bit. That's the example I gave you of the vitamin C, right? We still have the gene to make vitamin C, even though it doesn't work, because our body doesn't have an editing process, right? It's not like we can just say, your body doesn't say, oh, well, we don't need that gene anymore. It doesn't work. So let's just purge it from our genome. It doesn't work that way. It's still there. And many of these inactive genes are identified in humans. Again, vitamin C, all this stuff I'm saying. And I love that. That's one of my favorite examples. If I get a chance this weekend, I'm going to take that book out and reread it and go through, take notes of all the most interesting ones. There's some of them a little bit more boring, but some of them are pretty interesting. All right, the next one you need to know about is vestigial structures. You need to know what this is. Vestigial structures are remnants, well, I should say or, not of. Of is right, sorry. Remnants of features that served important functions, past tense, used to serve an important function, but don't anymore, right? And again, I have this book, and I need to refresh myself. There's a lot of fun examples. But from your old textbook, some examples are, if you look at ancient whales, not the ones that are alive today for the most part, but if you look at their fossils, some of them still have small pelvises and still have little tiny leg bones, even though they weren't using them, right? They were useless. They're just little tiny limbs that weren't being used, but they were still there. Cave fishes, they still have eye remnants. Even though they're blind, they live in caves, they don't need their eyes. They essentially don't have eyes, but there's still the parts there. Then here's a good human example, goosebumps. Not that you need to know this, but can anybody guess what feature goosebumps would serve? Or let me call them something else that might be a hint. Chill bumps. Does anybody know what purpose this would serve? Why would we have chill bumps? They don't really do us any good anymore, but what would be the purpose? No guesses? Well, when we were really covered in hair and your hair stood up on end like this, it would kind of form this little layer of air between your fur and you. So it'd be like an extra little blanket. So it was there to help keep you warm. And obviously now it doesn't do us any good that it used to. And again, I'm going to look at my book and try to give you some more examples. But if you want to look it up for our independent work, I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of parts in the human body that are just completely useless now. They're still there, but they're just useless. Not just human bodies, but again, whales, fish in caves. I think your current textbook uses the example of snakes. There's still some things about for example, snakes. Snakes all have two lungs, but one of them is pretty much useless because it's kind of hard to squeeze them both in there. So they have one functioning lung and then one little floppy, useless lung. Anyway, homologies can explain observations about embryonic development as well. So when we look at embryos, again, we see these homologies, these similarities. I'm not going to talk about this too much. I'm not going to ask any questions about it. But you can see in this picture, right, you have a human embryo on the right, chicken embryo on the left. They're very similar because we have a common ancestor way back. We have these pharyngeal pouches. Also, fish do too, and for the fish, those turn into gills. For humans, they turn into ears. All vertebrates have this post-anal tail as an embryo, right? So we have all these similarities. And again, that's an entire course too for some undergraduates. Any questions about that? All right. Again, some more evidence of evolution. Let's talk about biogeography very quickly. I'm probably not going to ask you any questions about this. But the geographic distribution of organisms, that's what biogeography is. I might ask you that. Let me put a question next to that. So the definition of biogeography is the geographic distribution of organisms. And it follows patterns that were best explained by the evolution in conjunction with the movement of tectonic plates. So I'm missing the word plates there. But, there used to be a supercontinent. You see here's Africa, there's Australia, there's the Indian plate, here's South America. You can't see North America here. But basically, the world used to be one big landmass. Actually, that's happened more than once. Anyway, so you can imagine things that lived in Africa could easily get over to South America because back then there was just one landmass. So there's going to be similarities in these animals, even though those continents are now really far apart. This is what those red lines show. There's similarities in all the work, not all, but a lot of the organisms that live in these areas. And I don't mean just animals, I'm talking about plants, fungi, and all that, right? They're very similar because back in the day, that used to be one big landmass. So they were evolving together. And then, like we talked about on Monday, there was that allopatric speciation, right? They got separated geographically. So all those critters that used to live right here and here, that used to have similar environments and were the same population, they got separated from each other. And things were different, right? The weather was different here. The climate was different here than it wasn't here. So over millions of years, they evolved some differences. But at one point, they were the same species. We had the common ancestor back when we had a common landmass. And that's all we have to say about biogeography. Any questions about that? All right, really quickly, let's talk about evolutionary trees. I'm almost definitely not going to ask you any questions about this, so we'll go through it really quickly. Darwin was the first to visualize the history of life as a tree with patterns of descent branching off from a common trunk. This will make more sense when I show you a picture. basically what I'm saying is this. He's the first person, and this is the way he drew it. I'm sure it was different. He was the first person to basically make you guys have seen a pedigree, right? You're like a family tree. Same thing, but instead of being individuals, we're talking about species. So he was kind of the first to do this. If anything, and I probably won't do this, but if anything, I might give you some picture like this on the exam and ask you a question about it. So if anything, you just need to understand how to interpret something like this. Like for example, if I said, which of these are more closely related? Crocodiles and ostriches, or let's say ostriches and lizards, right? Then you could look at this and see, okay, crocodiles and ostriches share this common ancestor, right? Ostriches and lizards share another common ancestor that's even farther back. So crocodiles and ostriches are more closely related. Does that make sense? They share one common ancestor, right? But this common ancestor is even farther back. And for mammals, the common ancestor is even farther back. And for amphibians, it's even farther back, right? So yeah, again, if anything, I might show you a picture like that and ask you to decipher it. But again, your book goes into a lot of detail. I do recommend reading it, but you guys are not biology majors, so this is stuff that's probably never going to come up in your life. Anyway, evolutionary trees are hypotheses reflecting current understanding of patterns of evolutionary descent. This almost goes back to what we were saying in the beginning of this discussion on Monday when we were talking about taxonomy. So in a sense, as far as we're concerned, evolutionary trees and taxonomy are the same thing, because taxonomy is how we classify organisms and how we put them into this group and put them into this larger group and put them into that larger group, right? It's the same thing, except now we're kind of mapping it, so to speak. We're visualizing it. But again, generally speaking, these are all hypotheses. And these hypotheses, the evidence is based on convincing combination of fossil, anatomical, and molecular data. And sometimes it's a little bit more speculative, just because we don't have enough information. And again, this is from your old textbook, and this is what I love about your old textbook, at least in this chapter. Then they go back to this idea of whale evolution. So remember, earlier in the chapter, they gave you one hypothesis and said, back in the day, I think it was the 60s, maybe the 70s, scientists thought whales were related to this. But then your book does a great job of saying, but then technology changed, and we had more data and more precise data, and because of that, we changed our hypothesis, and they said, all right, deer or whales are more related to this than that, right? Not that you need to know the example. The point here is that as as technology changes, as we get more data, science changes, right? Science doesn't always stay the same. Sometimes we realize we were wrong, and we have to change our conclusions. All right, that was almost an overview. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into natural selection. But before we do that, talk really quickly about artificial selection. Because Darwin reasoned that artificial selection, which you need to know what this is the selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals to promote the occurrence of desirable traits and offspring, was the key to understanding evolutionary change. So yes, when we think of Darwin, we think of natural selection. But artificial selection was already a thing when he was around, right? We already had dog breeds and horse breeds and all these different crops, right? Because we had already had artificial selection. And again, you need to know what artificial selection is. Artificial selection has two essential components. And you do need to know this because these are also the two essential components to natural selection. First of all, there has to be variation among the individuals. Just like in those peppered moths. Well, at first there wasn't any variation. At first they were just all light colored. And then randomly, and this had nothing to do with the smoke that we know of, there's no evidence to say it had anything to do with the smoke, but randomly, there was some black moths born. There was a mutation in one of those light moths that had a mutation. And then it gave birth, they gave birth to laid eggs, to some dark moths. So yeah, variation. And the other part of it is heritability, right? So again, if the variation is inheritable, then it doesn't matter. If you can't pass it along, if you're talking about artificial selection or natural selection, it doesn't matter. So any questions about the two essential components of artificial selection and, again, natural selection? We're talking about artificial selection right now, but again, those are the same two components. All right. So Darwin knew that individuals in natural populations have small but measurable differences, and that's what we call variation. And we're going to get in deeper and talk about variation a little bit more later. So he knew that was there, right? He knew it was there. What he didn't know was what forces were determining which individuals became the breeding stock for the next generation. So we knew that for humans, right? So we have really tiny dogs, and we have really big dogs, because with dogs, there's natural variation, right? So if somebody wanted to breed smaller dogs, like, all right, let's make this small dog with this small dog, right? Those were the decisions. Humans were making those decisions. But in natural selection, there's not humans making the decisions. So he didn't know what forces were making those decisions. But then there was this guy named Thomas Malthus. I'm probably not going to ask any questions about him, but his work was really important to Darwin. He contended that human disease, famine, and war were the consequences of human populations increasing faster than food and supplies and other resources. Basically, what he was saying, what he saw in the world was, when there's a struggle to survive, that's what's going to have war and crime and disease and poverty. So Darwin applied Malthus's ideas to populations of plants and animals. So he's talking about humans, but Darwin said, all right, well, let's take that idea and apply it to other living things, right? And he reasoned that resources of any given environment are limited, and the production of more individuals than the environment can support leads to a struggle for existence, and only some offspring survive in each generation. That is basically the essence of natural selection, right? It's hard for us to think of as humans, because generally speaking, we take care of each other, and we've kind of figured out how to battle nature, so to speak. But yeah, in other natural populations, that's exactly correct. Not every offspring survives. Not every offspring gets to reproduce. And it is the unequal reproduction that is the essence of natural selection, right? Individuals whose traits better enable them to survive and reproduce more successfully pass their traits off to their offspring, and that is what we call adaptation. So again, the adaptation, to be very clear here, is not that the individual changed. It's just the individual happened to be better equipped to survive. And because of that, because they're able to survive, they're able to pass along their genes, and therefore their offspring also had those phenotypes. And that is what we call adaptation. So again, the individual did not change. Just like the moths, right? There was no light moth that said, I better hide from the predator, and I'm going to turn dark, right? No single moth ever changed colors. So anyway, Darwin reasoned that if artificial selection can bring such a big change in a relatively short amount of time, then natural selection could modify species considerably, basically over millions, sometimes billions of years, right? So if humans can turn what used to be a wolf into a Shih Tzu, which is what's happened, right? You've seen dogs, there's Shih Tzus and Pomeranians and Chihuahuas, right? Those all used to be a wolf-like creature. The humans have changed that, and not that long ago, right? So if we could do that, surely nature could do that over millions of years. And let's see. The last word for attendance will be action. Same stuff. If you're watching the video later, take a picture, a screenshot of me pointing at the word action. We are done for the day. I'll keep an eye on the emails to see, try to look for your labs to see if you don't want to come in today.